The telegram was already burning in Benjamin Fairchild's hand when Mamie Dalton walked through the door of the Prosperity Town Council meeting and said, clear as a church bell on a still morning, "I heard there's a man in this room who's been lying to all of you for 3 years, and I think it's time somebody said so out loud." Every head turned. Every jaw dropped. The gaslight fixtures along the paneled walls of the council hall threw orange light across faces frozen mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-pretension. Mayor Harold Cutter's silver pocket watch hung forgotten from his fingers. Council member Everett Walsh's teacup hovered halfway to his lips. And Benjamin Fairchild, who had spent the better part of 4 years building something real and honest in this town, felt the telegram in his fist crinkle like a dying thing. Because he knew. He had known for exactly 47 minutes, since the telegram boy had pressed the folded paper into his palm outside the livery, that his hidden past had finally followed him to Prosperity, Colorado, in the form of a woman he had never expected to see again in his life. A woman who did not soften her words with social graces. A woman who did not wrap her truths in the kind of velvet packaging that this town demanded of everyone who wanted to be welcomed within its carefully pressed borders. Mamie Dalton stood in the doorway with her travel coat still dusty from the stagecoach, her dark hair pinned in a practical arrangement that had survived 30 miles of rough Colorado road better than most women's hairdos survived a Sunday church service. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and wore boots that had seen hard use. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of absolute directness, and she looked at every man in that room as though she had already decided what she thought of them and was simply waiting for them to catch up. "I beg your pardon," Mayor Cutter said, his voice rising with the particular kind of offended dignity that men of his stature employed when they had not been asked whether they wanted to be spoken to. "This is a closed session of the—" "I know what it is," Mamie said, stepping fully inside and setting her satchel on the nearest empty chair. "And I know what it isn't, which is a place where the truth has come anywhere near the conversation recently. I have documentation. I have letters. And I have the kind of patience for nonsense that runs about as thin as creek water in August." Benjamin had not moved. He was standing along the far wall, where he had positioned himself at the start of the meeting, as was his habit, close enough to observe, far enough that he could think. He was 32 years old, lean and sun-browned from years of outdoor work, with dark blonde hair that curled slightly at his collar and gray eyes that people in Prosperity had come to associate with careful, measured judgment. He had built a reputation in this town as a man of integrity. He had also, as of 47 minutes ago, received the news that the reputation he had left behind in his previous life, the one he had been running from, was about to walk through the door. He had not imagined it would look like this. He had not imagined it would look like her. He watched Mamie Dalton pull a sheaf of folded papers from her satchel with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times but was not nervous about it. He watched her lay the papers on the council table without so much as a tremor in her hands. And then, because he was a man who had spent 4 years learning that running from the truth was the most exhausting and ultimately futile exercise a person could undertake, Benjamin Fairchild walked away from the wall. He walked to the center of that room. He stood across the table from Mamie Dalton, who looked up at him with dark brown eyes that held something he had not expected, not accusation, but recognition, and possibly buried beneath layers of purpose and plain-speaking practicality, something that might have been relief. "You are Benjamin Fairchild," she said, "not a question." "I am," he said. "Then I think," she said, glancing briefly at the stunned faces of the council members arranged around them, "that you and I need to have a conversation." "I think," he said, and his voice was steady though nothing inside him was, "that you are absolutely right." It had started, as so many things in the Wild West year of 1883 started, with a journey that no sensible person would have undertaken alone. Mamie Dalton had grown up in Springfield, Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a newspaper printer, which meant she had been raised on the twin currencies of words and honesty. Her father, Thomas Dalton, had believed with the devotion of a convert that a newspaper existed to tell people the truth whether they wanted to hear it or not. Her mother, Clara, had believed with equal conviction that life was too short and too hard for anything other than plain speaking. Between them, they had produced a daughter who had inherited both traits in full measure and found them entirely compatible. In the spring of 1883, Thomas Dalton had died of a fever that swept through Springfield with little regard for the good or the wicked. Clara Dalton had followed him 3 weeks later, having decided apparently that a world without her husband was not one she intended to inhabit at length. Mamie had buried both her parents within a month, settled their modest affairs, and found herself at 26 with her father's printing press, a small but loyal readership, and the knowledge that the man who had purchased the adjoining property, a man named Gerald Whitmore, had been engaged in a systematic fraud that had cost several Springfield families their savings. Mamie had printed the story. She had printed it in full, with names and figures and supporting documentation, the way her father had always insisted a story worth telling was worth telling completely. Whitmore had responded by having his lawyers threaten her with a lawsuit for defamation. The lawsuit was without merit, but it was expensive to defend against, and Whitmore had made it plain through intermediaries that the lawsuit would multiply unless Mamie retracted the story. Mamie had not retracted the story. What she had done instead was gather every piece of documentation she possessed, pack her most essential belongings, and follow the trail of Whitmore's activities to its westward branches. Because it turned out that Gerald Whitmore's fraudulent land scheme was not limited to Springfield, Missouri. It extended, through a web of forged deeds and false promises, to a growing mining town in Colorado called Prosperity, where a man named Wade Hollister had been using Whitmore's financing to strip local ranchers of their land under the guise of legitimate mineral rights purchases. And somehow, connecting Whitmore's operation in Springfield to Hollister's operation in Prosperity, running between them like a hidden current, was the name Benjamin Fairchild. Mamie had spent 6 weeks tracing that name through letters and ledgers and county records before boarding the stagecoach west. She had not known what Benjamin Fairchild looked like. She had not known whether he was the victim of the scheme or a participant in it. What she had known was that if she wanted to expose Whitmore and protect the families he had defrauded, she needed to understand Fairchild's role, and the only way to understand it fully was to go to Prosperity and see for herself. She had not expected the town she found. Prosperity, Colorado, had been founded 11 years earlier as a supply point for the silver mining operations in the hills to the west. It had grown faster than most frontier towns, which meant it had developed, with almost suspicious speed, a layer of social pretension that its age and location did not entirely warrant. The main street was paved with wooden planks. The hotel had lace curtains in the windows. The women wore gloves to the post office and the men tipped their hats with elaborate ceremony. There was a social calendar. There was a reading circle. There were calling cards. Mamie had arrived on the 11 o'clock stage, dusty and direct, and had walked into the Grand Hotel to arrange a room. The clerk behind the desk had looked at her traveling clothes with the kind of delicate horror that people in Prosperity reserved for anything that had not been pressed within the last 24 hours, and had asked, with studied politeness, whether she had a reservation. "No," Mamie had said. "I need a room for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. I would like one with a window that faces the street so I can hear what is happening outside. And I will need a writing table, a good lamp, and someone to bring me a strong pot of coffee every morning before 8 o'clock. The clerk had blinked at her. "I don't require lace curtains," Mamie had added, "but if they are already there, I will not trouble you to remove them." This, she would learn later, was the moment that Prosperity's small but determined social machinery had begun to process her as an anomaly. Women in Prosperity did not state their requirements. They hinted at them obliquely, through layers of polite suggestion and deferential qualification, allowing the hotel staff to feel that they had divined the needs of their guests through superior perception rather than being told directly. It was a system of elaborate social theater that Mamie found both baffling and exhausting, and which she had abandoned within approximately 4 minutes of her arrival. She had gotten her room. She had gotten her window facing the street. She had set up her writing table, organized her documentation, and spent the rest of that first afternoon walking through prosperity with her eyes open and her notebook ready. By the following morning, she had identified 3 people who were clearly uncomfortable with the current arrangement of mineral rights in the surrounding valley. By the afternoon, she had found the deed office and spent 2 hours examining public records that told a story of systematic pressure on ranching families whose land sat above what were now thought to be significant silver deposits. By the evening, she had learned that Wade Hollister was a regular presence at the town council meetings. She had also, in the way that small towns always distributed information about newcomers, learned that Benjamin Fairchild was the town's land registry officer, a position he had held for 4 years, appointed originally by the territorial governor's office, which made him nominally independent of the local power structure, and that he was widely regarded as the most honest man in prosperity. People said it with a particular kind of emphasis that Mamie, who had grown up around journalism, recognized as the emphasis people used when they were telling you something that was both true and insufficient. She had gone to the council meeting that second evening specifically because she had learned, through the direct method of asking the woman who swept the hotel corridor every morning, that Wade Hollister was going to present a new set of mineral rights petitions to the council that evening, and that Benjamin Fairchild was going to be asked to certify them. What she had walked into was a room full of men in pressed suits who were in the process of making a decision they should not have been making, and a man standing at the far wall who had a telegram in his hand, and the look of someone who had just received very bad news and had not yet decided what to do about it. She had decided for him. After the council meeting, which ended in considerably more chaos than it had begun, with Mamie's documentation spread across the council table, and 3 of the 5 council members demanding explanations from a visibly shaken Wade Hollister, Benjamin Fairchild followed Mamie Dalton out of the building and caught up with her on the wooden boardwalk outside. "Miss Dalton," he said. She turned, and in the lamplight that spilled from the council hall windows, he got his first clear look at her face without the distraction of a room full of people. She had a face that was what his grandmother might have called sensible, which was not a word most men would have used but which Benjamin, who had always found his grandmother's vocabulary more useful than most people's, thought was exactly right. Strong features, direct gaze, the kind of bone structure that would still be interesting when she was 60. "You followed me," she said, not accusatory, observational. "I did," he said. "Because I need to know what you know and how you know it, and because I think we are, possibly, on the same side of this situation, and I would rather confirm that now than find out later that I was wrong about it." She studied him for a moment. The lamplight caught the gray of his eyes, which she had noticed inside a steady, unhurried color, the color of a sky that has made up its mind about the weather. "You said possibly," she noted. "I did," he said, "because I don't know you yet." "That is a reasonable position," she said. "I don't know you yet either." She paused. "The telegram you were holding when I walked in, it was from Springfield, wasn't it? From someone who knew I was coming." He did not insult her by pretending to be surprised. "It was from Gerald Whitmore's lawyer," he said, "warning me that a woman named Mamie Dalton was traveling to Prosperity with documents that were, in his words, damaging to several prominent business interests. He suggested I ensure the documents did not reach the council." Mamie's chin lifted slightly. "And you were going to do that?" "No," he said, with a simple directness that matched her own. "I was trying to determine what they contained before you arrived, and what I should do about my own position, which your documents appear to complicate significantly." She was quiet for a moment, reading him the way she read documentary evidence, looking for the inconsistencies, the gaps, the places where the stated facts and the actual facts did not quite align. "The letters connecting your name to Whitmore's operation," she said. "They appear to show you as a participant in the land scheme. I drew that conclusion before I came here, but I held it tentatively because the letters are in Whitmore's handwriting, not yours. I wanted to see for myself." She paused again. "The way you were standing at that wall when I walked in. You had that telegram. You looked like a man deciding whether to run or stand still. Men who are guilty usually run. Or they try to silence the thing coming at them." She tilted her head slightly. "You walked to the center of the room." "I did," he said. "Why?" Benjamin Fairchild looked at Mamie Dalton, this woman he had never met before tonight, this woman who had walked into the most carefully ordered room in Prosperity and set off a small social explosion simply by saying out loud what needed to be said. And he told her the truth, because it seemed insane to do anything else. "Because I have been running from the truth about my connection to Whitmore for 4 years, he said, "and I am profoundly tired of it. And because when you walked in and said what you said in the way that you said it, plainly, directly, without the 2 weeks of careful social maneuvering that everyone in this town requires before they will discuss anything of substance, I thought, here is someone who knows how this is supposed to work, and I did not want to waste another moment." The night air on the Prosperity boardwalk smelled of pine smoke and cooling dust. Down the street, the saloon was producing its usual evening sounds. Somewhere, a horse shifted in its stall. Mamie Dalton looked at Benjamin Fairchild for a long, measuring moment, and then she said something that was not what he expected. "That," she said quietly, "is the most refreshing thing I have heard in a very long time." He felt something shift inside him that he would not have been able to name right then. Not quite yet, but it was there. "Then perhaps," he said, "you would allow me to buy you a coffee at the hotel dining room, and I will tell you everything you need to know about my connection to Gerald Whitmore, so that when you decide what to do with that information, you will at least have the complete picture." "That," she said, picking up her satchel from where she had set it down on the boardwalk rail, "sounds like an excellent use of the next few hours." They walked down the main street of Prosperity together, and if the few people still out at that hour found it irregular that the town's land registry officer was walking companionably alongside the strange woman who had just disrupted the council meeting, neither of them noticed or particularly cared. The story Benjamin Fairchild told Mamie Dalton over 2 pots of coffee in the hotel dining room that night was the story he had been carrying alone for 4 years, and it came out of him with the relief of something that has been held under pressure for too long. He had come to Prosperity from Kansas City, where he had worked as a junior surveyor for a land development firm. The firm's principal client in the late 1870s had been Gerald Whitmore. Benjamin had been 28 years old, 2 years out of the territorial surveying school, and ambitious in the straightforward way of young men who have been told that hard work leads to advancement. He had done his work meticulously. He had surveyed parcels, calculated boundaries, prepared documentation. He had been, by every professional measure, excellent at his job. What he had not been was sufficiently skeptical about the purposes to which his work was being applied. Not until the winter of 1879, when he had been reviewing a set of deed transfers and discovered that several of the surveys he had completed showed different measurements than the ones that appeared in the filed documents. Someone had altered his work. Someone had changed the boundary markers on paper after the fact, absorbing a strip of adjoining property into Whitmore's holdings in a way that was not visible unless you compared the original survey to the filed deed. He had confronted his supervisor. His supervisor had told him to let it go. He had gone to Whitmore directly. Whitmore had smiled the smile of a man who had been managing inconvenient employees for decades, and had told Benjamin that the discrepancies were clerical errors, already corrected, and that his continued employment would benefit from a more relaxed attitude toward paperwork. Benjamin had gone home that night, and spent a long time thinking about his father, who had died working for a man exactly like Whitmore, and had died having accomplished nothing he had wanted to accomplish, because he had always chosen employment security over the right thing. In the morning, Benjamin had resigned, which had felt like freedom for exactly 11 days, until Whitmore's lawyers had sent him a letter explaining that they would be seeking damages for breach of contract, and that several of the falsified documents contained Benjamin's signature that Whitmore would be presenting as evidence of Benjamin's knowing participation in the fraud. The signatures were forgeries. But forged signatures were difficult and expensive to prove, especially when the man who had forged them had the kind of legal resources that Whitmore possessed. Benjamin had spent 18 months in a legal battle that drained his savings and his spirit in approximately equal measure. He had won. Ultimately, a territorial judge had accepted the handwriting evidence, but by then his reputation in Kansas City was sufficiently tangled in the association with Whitmore's scheme that finding new employment there was no longer feasible. He had come west. The territorial governor's office had been looking for experienced surveyors and land registry officers for the growing settlements in Colorado. Benjamin had presented his credentials, explained his history with Whitmore carefully, factually, without self-pity, and been given the position in Prosperity on the strength of his technical skills and the judge's ruling that had cleared his name. What he had not told anyone in Prosperity, because it had seemed both irrelevant to his current duties and too complicated to explain to people who had already formed their social judgments about him, was the full extent of his history with Whitmore. He had allowed people to assume that he was simply a territorial official with a clean record and steady judgment. He had done his job with integrity. He had resisted the pressure from Wade Hollister, Whitmore's man in Prosperity, on multiple occasions when Hollister had suggested that certain mineral rights certifications could be expedited through unofficial channels. But he had not been vocal about his knowledge of Whitmore's broader operation. He had not gone to the council with what he knew. He had told himself it was because he lacked sufficient evidence to make a formal accusation. He had told himself it was because his position required neutrality. He had told himself a number of things that were technically true and collectively inadequate. The truth, the version he told Mamie Dalton over cooling coffee at 2 in the morning in the hotel dining room in Prosperity, Colorado, was simpler and harder. He had been afraid. Not of Whitmore's lawyers this time, he had survived those. He had been afraid of losing the thing he had built here. The quiet, functional, honest life. The reputation. The sense of being known, finally, as a man of integrity. The knowledge that if he pulled on the thread of Whitmore's operation in Prosperity, it might unravel back to him in ways that he could explain, but that would require him to explain them, publicly, in a town where he had carefully avoided having anything to explain. And now? Mamie asked when he had finished. "Now you've walked in and pulled the thread," he said, and the ghost of something that was not quite a smile crossed his face. "So the question of whether I was going to do it eventually is rather academic." "I want to be clear about something," Mamie said, folding her hands on the table in the way she did when she was about to say something that required attention. "The letters that connect your name to Whitmore's operation in my documentation, I believe you now when you say they were constructed to implicate you. But I need you to help me prove it, because without that proof the story I publish will be incomplete, and an incomplete story is not only less effective, it can be weaponized against the people it's meant to protect." "You're a journalist," he said. He had understood this from the documentation, but hearing it stated directly made it more real. "My father's daughter," she said. "Yes." "In a town like Prosperity," he said, "that is going to cause some difficulty. The social machinery here is not kind to women who make themselves prominent." She looked at him steadily. "I grew up in a household where the definition of a problem was something that had not yet been solved." Is that a statement of concern or a warning or an explanation? He thought about it. "An explanation," he said. I want you to know what you're walking into so you can plan accordingly, not because I think it will stop you." Something softened very slightly at the corners of her eyes. "That," she said, "is a more thoughtful response than most people manage." They worked out the broad structure of it there at the table, in the quiet of the empty dining room with the lamp burning low. Mamie had documentation from Springfield Whitmore's letters, the altered deeds, the testimony of two families who had lost land to his scheme. Benjamin had 4 years of observation in Prosperity, the specific patterns of Hollister's land petition filings, the signatures on mineral rights transfers that he had quietly preserved copies of, the moment 18 months ago when Hollister had offered him a significant sum of money to certify a transfer he had declined to certify. He had written a memorandum of that offer at the time and filed it with the territorial governor's office, something he had not mentioned to anyone in Prosperity and which now seemed enormously relevant. "You filed a memorandum with the governor's office," Mamie said, and her voice had a new quality in it, something between professional satisfaction and something warmer. "I did," he said. "I was protecting myself. It seemed like the kind of thing Whitmore would try to deny later." "Benjamin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and neither of them commented on it, but they both noticed. "That memorandum is the piece I was missing." He noticed, looking at her in the lamplight, that she had been traveling for 30 miles by stagecoach and sitting in a tense council meeting, and then conducting a 2-hour working interview, and she looked fully present and entirely focused. Not tired, not diminished. He had met very few people in his life who had that quality, the ability to be entirely where they were, regardless of circumstances. "I'll write to the governor's office tomorrow," he said. "Request a certified copy. It should arrive within a week." "Good," she said. She paused. "Wade Hollister will not be pleased about tonight." "No," he said, "he won't." "Will he become a problem?" Benjamin thought about Hollister, the heavy-shouldered man with small eyes who had been sitting at the council table when Mamie walked in, and who had left the meeting faster than anyone else once Mamie's documentation began to make its impact. "He will," he said. "He's not a violent man himself, but he has money and he has influence, and he will use both." "I have dealt with men like Hollister before," Mamie said. "I know," he said. "I could tell by the way you set your satchel down when you walked into that room, like you were settling in for a long session, not a short one." She looked at him with frank curiosity. "You noticed that?" "I notice things," he said simply. "It's what I do." She nodded slowly, as though that answered a question she had been holding. "Then we had better get some sleep," she said, gathering her papers with the same economical efficiency she brought to everything. "We have work to do starting in the morning." He stood when she stood, because his mother had raised him with manners, and said good night in the quiet of the empty dining room, and watched her walk up the hotel staircase with her satchel over her shoulder and her spine perfectly straight. He stood in the empty dining room for a moment after she had gone, and thought that he could not remember the last time a conversation had made him feel simultaneously more complicated and more simple, more seen and less burdened. He went to bed, and for the first time in 4 years, did not lie awake thinking about the things he should have done differently. The next 2 weeks in Prosperity were, by the standards of a town that had carefully cultivated an atmosphere of serene gentility, approximately as disruptive as a silver mine blast in the drawing room. Mamie Dalton did not adapt to Prosperity's social conventions. She moved through them with the cheerful courtesy of someone who finds them interesting but not binding. She attended the reading circle, to which she had been somewhat reluctantly invited, and expressed frank opinions about the book under discussion. She visited the 3 ranching families whose land was most immediately threatened by Hollister's pending mineral rights petitions, and sat at their kitchen tables drinking their coffee, and taking their testimony in the direct, respectful manner of someone who believed that ordinary people's experiences were the most important information available. She asked questions that no one in Prosperity usually asked out loud, and she wrote down the answers, and she did all of this with a warmth and a lack of condescension that tended to win people over before they had decided whether to be won. She also filed a formal inquiry with the territorial governor's office in Denver, citing the specific document irregularities she had identified, and she talked to Benjamin Fairchild every day. This last fact was noted by the social machinery of prosperity with considerable interest. Benjamin Fairchild had been, in his 4 years in the town, notably inaccessible as a romantic prospect. He was polite, he was respected, he attended the necessary social functions, but he had deflected every attempt to introduce him to eligible young women with the gentle but unmistakable firmness of a man who had decided, for reasons he kept to himself, that romantic entanglement was not on his current agenda. He and Mamie did not conduct themselves romantically. They met each morning at the land registry office, where Benjamin had the records and she had the analytical context to make sense of them. They reviewed documents together. They reconstructed Hollister's filing pattern across 4 years of mineral rights petitions. Benjamin explained the technical dimensions of survey law, and Mamie explained the documentary evidence from Springfield, and between them they built something that was beginning to look very much like a complete and airtight case. But they also, in the gaps between the work, talked. They talked about Springfield and Kansas City, about Thomas Dalton and his printing press, and his belief that the truth was the only thing worth printing, about Benjamin's father and the choices that had defined and diminished his life, about the particular difficulty of being a person of strong convictions in places where strong convictions were considered socially inconvenient. On the 4th day, they walked together to the eastern edge of town to meet with a rancher named Ephraim Coles, whose homestead sat directly above a mineral deposit that Hollister had been working to acquire for 2 years. Coles was a solidly built man in his 50s who had come west from Georgia after the war and had built his ranch with 15 years of grinding, patient work. He received them in his kitchen, where his wife Alice served them coffee and corn bread, and watched the conversation with sharp, quiet attention. Coles had documents of his own, a packet of letters from Hollister's land agents that had been growing in a tin box under his kitchen floorboard since 1881. The letters were not explicit exactly, but they were what Mamie, reading them with practiced speed, would later describe as the kind of subtle coercion that stops just short of a legal threat while conveying every element of one. They made it plain enough, Coles said, turning his coffee cup in his large, work-roughened hands. Sell or find yourself in court over survey irregularities, and I knew the surveys were clean because Mr. Fairchild here had done them himself, so I knew that was an invented threat. But invented threats still cost money to fight. Not anymore, they won't, Mamie said. She looked at Coles with a quiet steadiness that Benjamin had noticed she deployed specifically when she was making a promise. When this is fully documented and filed, the threat becomes the evidence. They've implicated themselves. Coles looked at her, then at Benjamin. You trust her? He asked with the directness of a man who had not been long in prosperity's social customs. I do, Benjamin said, and he realized as he said it that this was no longer simply a professional assessment. On the walk back to town, with the Colorado afternoon light turning the sagebrush to gold and the mountains to the west going purple at their tops, Mamie said, apparently thinking about Coles, his wife didn't say much. She didn't need to, Benjamin said. She was listening for the things that didn't quite fit, checking the story for gaps. He paused. You do that too? I suppose I do, she said. My mother used to say that the most useful person in any conversation is the one who is still listening. Your mother sounds like she was remarkable. She was, Mamie said, and there was a simplicity in the way she said it that was also grief, clean and undisguised. She and my father both were. They built something honest together and they believed in it completely, and they were never ashamed of it. She was quiet for a moment. I think the hardest part of losing them, other than the missing them, which is constant, is knowing that the thing they built died with them. The paper, the press, everything they worked for. "Not everything," Benjamin said. "You're here." She glanced at him, surprised in a way she rarely was. He had said it simply, without performance, and he meant it simply. Everything about her, the directness, the precision, the willingness to walk into a room full of powerful men and say the thing that needed saying, was the product of what those two people had built together. The paper had ended. The work had not. She did not say anything for a few steps, and he did not press her to. The afternoon light moved over the sagebrush, and somewhere in the distance a hawk called once. "That," she said eventually, "is a very kind thing to say." "It's a true thing," he said. "I try to keep those in good supply." She laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh, not the careful, measured social laughter that Prosperity's female residents produced at appropriate intervals. It was a short laugh and quickly contained, but it was real, and it did something to the afternoon that Benjamin could not have precisely described. He was falling in love with her. He knew this with the quiet certainty of a man who has been trained to measure things accurately. He had not expected it, not planned for it, not particularly wanted the complication of it. But there it was, solid and factual as a survey marker, and pretending otherwise would have been the kind of dishonesty he had spent 4 years trying to eliminate from his life. He did not say any of this. It was too soon, and they had work to do, and Mamie Dalton was not a woman who needed a man's feelings announced at her when she was in the middle of a professional undertaking of some consequence. But he allowed himself to know it privately, in the way that solid things are known. Wade Hollister made his move on the 9th day. It was not violent, which Benjamin had expected, but it was ugly in the way that well-funded coercion tends to be ugly. Hollister arranged for 2 members of the town council, the ones whose personal finances were most entangled with his mineral operation, to formally request that the governor's office review Benjamin's 4-year record as land registry officer, citing unspecified concerns about improper documentation practices. It was a transparent attempt to preemptively discredit the memorandum that Mamie and Benjamin had already requested from the governor's records. At the same time, Hollister's lawyer sent a letter to the hotel management, suggesting that Mamie's continued residency was causing disruption to the establishment's other guests. The hotel manager, a soft-spoken man named Davies who liked a quiet life and disliked Hollister's pressure equally, came to Mamie's room to deliver this message with visible embarrassment and a strong implication that he did not personally agree with it. Mamie thanked him for telling her, asked whether she was actually causing any disruption to other guests as far as he was aware, and when Davies admitted that she was not, told him that she would be happy to remain, and that if Hollister's lawyer contacted him again, she would appreciate being informed of the content of those communications. Davies, who had been in Prosperity long enough to be tired of being managed by Hollister's money, said he thought he could manage that. Benjamin came to tell Mamie about the council review request that same afternoon and found her at her writing table with a cup of coffee and the particular focused expression she wore when a problem had revealed itself to be exactly what she had been expecting. "He's scared," she said, without looking up from what she was writing. "This is what scared people do. They attack the credibility of the thing they're afraid of." "Which is your documentation and my memorandum," Benjamin said, sitting in the chair across from her writing table, which had become, over 9 days of working together, a comfortable and natural position for both of them. "Yes," she said, setting down her pen and looking at him. "Which means we need to be ready for the review. Are your records in order? Every document I have filed in 4 years is accurate, complete, and cross-referenced," he said. "I built this record specifically as a defense against the kind of challenge Whitmore would eventually make. I knew this day was coming. I simply did not know what form it would take." "Good." She picked up her pen again, made a note on the paper in front of her, and then set it down again and looked at him with a directness that held something more personal than the usual working focus. "Benjamin, are you all right?" He thought about this with the honesty it deserved. "I'm better than I've been in 4 years," he said, which is a strange thing to say about a situation that is objectively precarious. "It's not strange," she said. "It makes sense to feel better when you're finally moving towards something instead of sitting still waiting for it to find you." He looked at her in the afternoon light coming through the window she had specifically requested face the street. She was still in her working clothes. She had a small, practical wardrobe that she rotated through with the efficiency of someone who found clothing logistics a poor use of mental energy, with her hair pinned neatly and a smudge of ink on her right forefinger that she had not noticed. She looked exactly like herself, which was the only version of herself she apparently ever presented. "Mamie," he said. She looked up, something in his tone shifting her expression from professional focus to attention of a different kind. "I want to say something that has nothing to do with the case," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because you've made it clear that is the mode of communication you find most useful, and also because it is the only mode I trust myself to get right with you specifically." She waited. Not nervously. She was never nervous, but with a quality of stillness that meant she was listening with her full attention. "I am falling in love with you," he said. "I think you should know that, because it seems like the kind of information a person ought to have when it concerns them. I'm not telling you because I expect anything from it, or because it changes anything about what we're doing here. I'm telling you because it's true and because hiding true things from you feels, at this point, like a specific kind of cowardice I am not willing to practice." Mamie Dalton was quiet for a long moment. In the street below, two horses passed at a walk, their shoes making the unhurried, rhythmic sound that was one of the constants of a western town. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. "I appreciate the directness," she said, finally. And then, more quietly, "I would be less than honest if I told you that the feeling is entirely one-sided." Benjamin felt something shift in the room that was not quite a change in the light but felt like one. "That is good to know," he said. "However," she said, with the tone of someone completing a thought that had two parts, "I need to finish what I came here to do before I can think clearly about anything else. The families who lost land to Whitmore, the Coles family, the others, they came first." "Of course they did," he said, immediately and without reservation. "I wouldn't have it any other way." She studied him for a beat, as though checking whether the answer was genuinely meant or socially performed. Then she nodded once, satisfied. "Then let us finish this," she said, picking up her pen. He sat across from her in the afternoon light and went back to his own work, and it was the most comfortable silence he had experienced in years. The governor's certified copy of Benjamin's memorandum arrived on the 11th day. It arrived, usefully, the same day as a letter from the Regional Federal Land Office in Denver, responding to Mamie's formal inquiry with a notification that they were opening a preliminary investigation into the mineral rights transfer filings in the Prosperity District. The federal inquiry changed the geometry of the situation entirely. Hollister's leverage had rested on his ability to manage the local council. Federal investigators operated outside that management. Hollister left Prosperity on the 12th day. His departure was noted by several people and publicly explained by his lawyer as a business trip to Denver. Mamie, who had been writing her account of the situation in careful, documented stages, noted the departure in the piece she was preparing with the observation that a man with nothing to hide does not typically remove himself from the vicinity of an investigation. She sent the completed account, along with full copies of her documentation, to 3 newspapers: the Denver Post, the Rocky Mountain News, and the Springfield paper that had been her father's competitor, and which, she had reason to believe, would find the completion of the Whitmore story significant. She also sent a full copy to Gerald Whitmore's lawyer in Springfield with a cover note explaining precisely what it contained and when it would be published. The morning after she sent the dispatches, she came down to breakfast at the hotel dining room and found Benjamin already at the table she had come to think of as theirs, with coffee poured and the day's newspaper folded beside his elbow. He looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face was not the slightly guarded, careful look he sometimes wore when he was managing something. It was simply open and warm, and the kind of glad that does not perform itself. "It's done," she said, sitting across from him. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it with the honest attention she gave to all questions worth asking. "Like I have put something down that I was carrying for my parents," she said. "Like the weight is still there, but the shape of it has changed." She paused. "And hungry. I am extremely hungry. I did not eat anything yesterday." He laughed. She had noticed that his laughter, which he gave freely when something was genuinely funny, had a quality of complete unself-consciousness that was rare in men who had learned to manage their own image, and called for the waitress. Over eggs and toast and an unreasonable quantity of coffee, they talked about what came next. For Mamie, the shape of it was becoming clearer. The Springfield paper she had operated on her father's press was gone, but the press itself was in storage. There was the possibility of using the coverage of the Whitmore case as a foundation for something new. She had not yet determined where, but she had been thinking, she said, about the fact that Prosperity had no newspaper of its own, which was remarkable for a town that had the commercial activity it did and the kind of civic self-regard that resulted in calling cards and lace curtains. Prosperity would resist a newspaper, Benjamin said. Or more precisely, the people who currently control Prosperity's information flow would resist one. "That is exactly why it needs one," Mamie said. He smiled. He had not expected anything else. "I was not arguing against it," he said. "I was noting the obstacle." "I know," she said. "You are a man who notes obstacles so that they can be planned around, not so that they can be used as reasons to stop." He looked at her across the table in the morning light. She had a way, he had noticed, of saying true things about him that he had not said about himself, and that were nevertheless more accurate than his own self-assessment. It was one of the many things about her that he found both entirely unnerving and entirely necessary. "What are you thinking?" she asked, reading something in his expression. "I'm thinking," he said, "that when this investigation concludes, and when you've decided what your next undertaking is going to be, I would very much like to be part of it. In whatever capacity makes sense, as a colleague or as something more depending on what you want." He paused, "and I'm aware that is quite a declaration to make over breakfast." "I like breakfast declarations," she said. "They tend to be more honest than dinner ones. People are more tired in the morning, less likely to perform." "Is that yes?" he asked. "It is," she said. "Or it is going to be. Give me a little room." "I will give you all the room you need," he said, meaning it completely. She looked at him, and for a moment, Mamie Dalton, who was not generally a woman whose face revealed things it was not intending to reveal, looked exactly as she felt, which was, carefully and deliberately and with full awareness of what she was doing, beginning to let something happen that she had not particularly expected, and that she was choosing, actively and without reservation, to let continue. "Thank you," she said quietly. The federal investigation moved with what was, for a government process, surprising speed, partly because Mamie's documentation was meticulous, and partly because the Denver newspapers picked up the story with the enthusiasm of papers that recognized a significant fraud case when they saw one. Gerald Whitmore's operations in Springfield came under simultaneous scrutiny, and the combination of the Missouri and Colorado evidence was sufficient to prompt the appointment of a special territorial investigator. The investigator, a precise man named Harris from the Federal Land Office, arrived in Prosperity 6 weeks after Mamie's initial council meeting. He met with Benjamin for 2 days, reviewing the registry records and the memorandum. He met with Mamie for most of a 3rd day, working through her documentation with the focused efficiency of someone who appreciated having the work already half done. He met with the Coles family and 2 other ranching families similarly situated. He issued a preliminary finding that froze all pending mineral rights transfers in the Prosperity District pending full review. Wade Hollister, who had returned from Denver after 10 days having apparently failed to manage the situation from that end, was served with a formal notice of investigation in the lobby of the Grand Hotel. He did not respond gracefully. He made several statements to the council members he still controlled, statements that characterized Benjamin as a man of compromised loyalty and Mamie as an outside agitator pursuing a personal vendetta. These statements were reported by the newspaper in Denver, which quoted them in full, and then set them against the documentary record, which did not support them. On the day that Harris's full report went to the federal land commissioner in Washington, a report that recommended the reversal of 23 fraudulent mineral rights transfers and the referral of both Hollister and Whitmore to federal prosecutors, Mamie was sitting in the land registry office reviewing the final confirming documents with Benjamin when one of the council members, a man named Patterson, who had been one of the more reasonable ones from the beginning, knocked on the office door and came in. Patterson was 61 years old and had been in Prosperity since its founding. He was a man who had spent his career navigating the social weather of a small, ambitious town, which had not always served him well, but who had, at the center of it, a basic decency that had occasionally surfaced at inconvenient times for his political position. He took off his hat when he came in, which was not required in a land office. "Miss Dalton," he said. "Mr. Fairchild." He paused, seeming to choose his words with more care than usual. "I want to say on behalf of a council that did not cover itself in glory over the last several months, that what the two of you have done here was necessary, and that the town is better for it, even those who don't yet know enough to say so." Mamie looked at him with the steady, unhurried gaze she gave to all statements she was evaluating for sincerity. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson," she said. "The council," Patterson continued, "has authorized me to offer Miss Dalton the use of the vacant building on the east end of Main Street for a period of 1 year at nominal cost, should she wish to establish a publication in Prosperity." He cleared his throat. It was not a unanimous vote, but it was a majority. Mamie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell the council that I will accept the building. And tell the 2 members who voted against that I intend to cover the activities of this council with absolute fairness, which means they will receive the same coverage as everyone else, neither better nor worse than they deserve." Patterson almost smiled. "I'll tell them exactly that," he said. After he left, Benjamin turned to Mamie, who was looking at the middle distance with the expression she wore when she was constructing something. "You're going to stay," he said. "I'm going to stay," she confirmed. Then she looked at him, and the expression shifted to something more direct and more personal. "I came here to do a job, and the job is done. Now I'm staying because I want to." She paused, which is a different thing entirely. He crossed the room and stood close to her, and she did not step back. He was close enough to see that her eyes, which he had catalogued as simply dark brown in their first meeting, were actually a warm brown with a ring of gold near the center, like sunlit earth. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. "When you've got the paper set up," he said, "and you've hired whatever staff you need, and you've been in Prosperity long enough to know for certain that it's where you want to be, will you consider making this permanent? The 2 of us. A life, not just an arrangement." She was looking directly at him, and her face had the quality it sometimes had when she had already arrived at an answer and was deciding how to deliver it. "I've already considered it," she said. "I considered it approximately 17 days ago when you told me the truth about Whitmore and Kansas City at 2 in the morning over bad coffee and didn't once try to manage what I thought about it." She tilted her head slightly. "I have a condition." "Name it," he said. "We do this as equals," she said. "In every sense. My work is my own. My voice is my own. You don't manage what I print or soften what I write, even when it's uncomfortable." "Mamie," he said, and he was smiling, which she rarely saw him do with his whole face, "I have watched you walk into a room full of powerful men and tell them things they did not want to hear without once checking whether anyone approved. The last thing I would do is ask you to stop." "Good," she said. And then she covered the remaining distance between them herself, because she was Mamie Dalton and she had never waited for someone else to do the thing she had decided to do, and she kissed Benjamin Fairchild in the afternoon light of the Prosperity Land Registry office. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not decorative. It was the kind of kiss that people give each other when they have been telling each other the truth for several weeks and have decided that this is also a truth worth telling. When they parted, he said, very quietly, "That was also the most refreshing thing I have experienced in a considerable time." She laughed, and this time the laugh was long and unguarded and entirely real. They were engaged by the end of that November, which caused a significant social discussion in Prosperity, primarily because Benjamin Fairchild had been considered, for 4 years, safely and permanently unavailable, and the fact that he had been captured by an outspoken woman from Missouri who ran her own newspaper and had personally contributed to the removal of the town's most prominent businessman, was a narrative that the social machinery found both fascinating and challenging to categorize. Mamie published the engagement notice in the first issue of the Prosperity Courier, which she launched in October 1883 with a printing press she had ordered from a Denver equipment supplier, her own savings, and her father's careful technical instruction embedded in her memory. She wrote the notice herself, simply and without elaboration: Benjamin Fairchild and Mamie Dalton, to be married in the spring. The first issue of the Courier was 4 pages. It contained a full account of the federal investigation's findings and their implications for the local ranching families, a piece on the state of the road between Prosperity and the county seat that had been in poor repair for 2 years and about which no one had previously found it useful to write, a column of news from the surrounding settlements, and an editorial by Mamie herself on the subject of civic honesty, which was written with the same plain-speaking directness that characterized everything she produced, and which was reprinted in its entirety by the Denver paper the following week. The subscription list filled faster than she had projected. People in Prosperity, it turned out, had been hungry for information delivered without the social filtering that had previously governed all public communication in the town. Even people who had been among Mamie's initial critics found themselves reading the Courier with attention and, often, relief. The federal prosecution moved forward through the winter. Both Gerald Whitmore and Wade Hollister were indicted by a federal grand jury in Denver in January of 1884. Whitmore's defense attempted, predictably, to reintroduce the allegation of Benjamin's involvement, presenting the forged signature letters as evidence. The territorial judge, a different one from the judge who had ruled in Benjamin's favor in Kansas City, but one who had read that ruling carefully, rejected them. The handwriting analysis was conclusive. Benjamin was cleared definitively and publicly, and the Denver papers reported it with the same prominence they had given the original investigation. The ranching families whose land had been fraudulently threatened received confirmation that their property rights were fully restored. Ephraim Coles, hearing the news from Benjamin in person, shook his hand for a long time without saying anything, and then said simply, "Your wife is going to be something, Fairchild." He had been calling Mamie Benjamin's wife for 2 months before the wedding, apparently on the reasonable grounds that the outcome was already clear. They were married in March of 1884 in the Prosperity Church, which was a small, solid building on the north end of Main Street that smelled of pine wood and beeswax candles. Mamie wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool, practical and unfussy, with her hair pinned in the same arrangement she wore every day but with a small wreath of dried wildflowers, which had been Alice Coles's idea. Benjamin wore his best suit, which had been pressed by the hotel laundry with meticulous attention, and stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. Patterson conducted the ceremony, having received his ordination from a correspondence ministry the previous autumn, a fact that Mamie found genuinely touching and wrote about briefly in the Courier with his permission. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones. There had been a brief conversation about writing their own, which Mamie had suggested and Benjamin had been open to, but they had ultimately decided that the traditional vows said what they meant and that elaborating on them would be performance for its own sake. Mamie Dalton did not elaborate for performance. She said yes, and she meant all of it. The celebration afterward was at the hotel dining room, which Davies the manager had prepared with genuine warmth and only moderate lace. The Coles family came. Half the ranching valley came. Patterson came and ate more than anyone present. Several of the council members came and were gracious about it. The two who had voted against the building offer came and were civil if not enthusiastic, and Mamie treated them with the same courteous attention she gave everyone, which was the most pointed thing she could have done, and which she knew it. Benjamin danced with her twice, which was all the dancing that the evening's fiddler could sustain after a certain hour, and he was not a man who had danced recently or often, and she was not particularly worried about being danced with perfectly. And they moved around the small floor that Davies had cleared of tables with the entirely adequate competence of two people who were more interested in being close to each other than in performing any particular skill. "You are still the most direct person I have ever met in my life," he said, close to her ear. "Is that a problem?" she asked. "It is the opposite of a problem," he said. They moved into the house that Benjamin had been renting on the south side of town, which had a room with good light that Mamie had immediately identified as a future office. She continued to run the Courier from the Main Street building, which she had expanded from 4 pages to 6 within 3 months of the launch. Benjamin continued as land registry officer through the spring, when the governor's office extended his appointment with a commendation letter that specifically noted the quality of his record-keeping and his role in the federal investigation. In the summer of 1884, the governor's office offered Benjamin a promotion to regional land commissioner, based in Denver. He discussed it with Mamie for 3 evenings in a row, which was how they handled major decisions, thoroughly, honestly, from all angles. Mamie did not want to move the Courier. The Courier was, in its first year, doing exactly what she had come to Prosperity to do, and uprooting it would mean starting over in a city where there were already 3 established papers. But she told him plainly that this was her preference, not a demand, and that she would support whatever he decided. Benjamin declined the promotion. He wrote back to the governor's office explaining that he found his current position most useful, was committed to the Prosperity community, and was grateful for the recognition. It was the right answer, arrived at honestly, and neither of them had any regrets about it. In October of 1884, 1 year after the first issue of the Prosperity Courier, Mamie told Benjamin that they were expecting a child. She told him in the morning, over coffee, the same time and setting as so many of the true things between them, and he set down his cup and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. A complete, unguarded, wholly uncomplicated happiness. Their son was born in the late spring of 1885, at the end of a long and typically unruly Colorado spring. They named him Thomas James Fairchild Thomas for Mamie's father, James for Benjamin's, because it seemed right that both men who had shaped their parents' characters should be present in the name of the child who would benefit from those characters. Thomas arrived with a great deal of opinion about the process of arriving, and continued in this vein through his first months, and Mamie found, to her satisfaction, that she was well equipped to handle a person with strong opinions. Benjamin, who had not previously spent significant time with infants, proved to be one of those men who take to fatherhood with natural ease, quietly consistent, endlessly patient, the kind of father who sits beside a sleeping child for no practical reason, except the pleasure of watching a person he loves exist. Mamie watched this happen with the clear-eyed attention she brought to everything, and felt a gratitude that was too large for the kind of plain words she usually employed. So she said it differently, in the way that existed between them, a hand on his arm while he was reading to Thomas before sleep, a cup of coffee set beside him in the morning without being asked, the small daily languages of a life built together. The Prosperity Courier continued. By 1886, it was the most read paper in the county, which now included 4 settlements in addition to Prosperity itself. Mamie had hired a typesetter, a young man from Kansas named Elias who had learned the trade in Topeka and who had come west looking for work, and who turned out to have the combination of technical skill and genuine enthusiasm for words that made him, over time, a person she trusted with significant independence. She wrote every editorial herself. She continued to report on civic matters with the directness that had made the paper's reputation, and she continued to receive letters from people who found this approach either refreshing or alarming in roughly equal proportion. She wrote about the ranching families and their recovery. She wrote about the mining operations in the Western Hills, covering both the economic benefits and the conditions of the miners who worked them, which was not a popular subject with the mine owners, but which she pursued on the grounds that it was important. She wrote, when a Ute family was displaced from a traditional camping ground by a new road construction project in the spring of 1886, a piece that acknowledged the systematic injustices of Western expansion with the same plain honesty she brought to everything else, and which generated more reader response than anything she had published, divided roughly between readers who thanked her and readers who canceled their subscriptions, and which she would later describe as the piece she was most proud of. Benjamin read everything she wrote. He had opinions about some of it, not about whether she should write it, but about the substance, the implications, the things that the documentation showed and didn't show. She valued his opinions, argued with several of them, incorporated a few, and occasionally published corrections when subsequent information showed that a first account had been incomplete. She had a policy about corrections. They ran in the same size type as the original piece, in the same position, without qualification or excuse. It was her father's policy, and she kept it. In the fall of 1886, Gerald Whitmore was convicted on 12 counts of federal land fraud and sentenced to 7 years in the federal penitentiary in Detroit. Wade Hollister, who had cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge, received a 2-year sentence and was released after 18 months. He did not return to Colorado. The Courier covered both convictions, and Mamie wrote the final piece on the Whitmore case herself, beginning with the night in March of 1883 when she had first pulled the thread on his Springfield operation, tracing it through every stage to its conclusion. She did not write about herself, which was her consistent practice. But she wrote about Thomas Dalton's printing press and his belief that a story worth telling was worth telling completely. And she wrote about the families who had gotten their land back. And she wrote about the value, the genuine, material, life-changing value of saying plainly and on the record what is true. Benjamin read that piece in proof before it ran, sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas asleep in the next room, and when he was done he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "Your father would be proud," he said. "I hope so," she said. "He would be," Benjamin said, "and your mother, and it is not a small thing, Mamie." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight. This man she had walked into a room and met in the middle of the most consequential night of her professional life. This man who had told her the truth at 2 in the morning and walked to the center of the room when it would have been easier to stay at the wall. This man who held their son with the quiet ease of a person who has found, without having expected to, that love is large enough to keep expanding. "No," she said, "it is not a small thing." She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers, and the lamp burned steady in the Colorado night, and outside, the main street of Prosperity was quiet and dark, and somewhere in the distance the mountains that had watched over all of it stood exactly where they had always been. Their second child arrived in the summer of 1888, a daughter this time, born in the heat of a July that had the whole valley moving slowly and speaking softly. They named her Clara, for Benjamin's mother and Mamie's both, because there seemed no better way to honor 2 women who had raised 2 people who had found each other in the necessary chaos of an honest life. Clara arrived with considerably less opinion about the process than Thomas had displayed, but proved, over her first months, to be watchful in a way that Mamie recognized, the particular quality of attention that her own mother had possessed, present and quiet and missing nothing. Thomas, who was 3 and approaching the situation with the authority of a person whose territory had just been reorganized, required approximately 2 weeks to decide that Clara was acceptable. After that, he assumed a proprietorial interest in her welfare that expressed itself primarily as a determination to narrate everything in her vicinity at high volume, apparently on the theory that his sister would benefit from a continuous account of all observable events. Benjamin managed this with his characteristic patient humor. Mamie found it genuinely endearing and wrote a brief column about the behavior of 3-year-olds in the presence of new siblings that ran in the Courier's lighter, inside pages, and generated a remarkable number of letters of recognition from parents across the county. The house on the south side of town had been expanded by then. Benjamin had added 2 rooms in the spring of 1887 with the help of Ephraim Coles, who turned out to be an accomplished carpenter, and Elias the typesetter, who was less accomplished but enthusiastic. The room with good light had become Mamie's home office, where she did the writing for the Courier when she was not at the Main Street building, which allowed her to work while Thomas slept and later, while Thomas played in the yard under the supervision of whatever combination of neighbors and small animals had appointed themselves to this task on a given afternoon. The Prosperity Courier ran a 7-year anniversary edition in October of 1890, which Mamie marked with an editorial about what the paper had set out to do and what it had managed. She was 33 years old. The paper had a circulation that extended to 6 settlements. It had covered a federal fraud prosecution, multiple civic controversies, a significant mining accident in 1887 that had prompted an inquest into mine safety practices, a severe winter in 1886–87 that had required coordinated community response across the valley, and 7 years of the ordinary remarkable life of a growing frontier community. She wrote, in that anniversary editorial, about plain speaking, about what it meant to say the true thing without the social softening that turned truth into something polite and toothless. She wrote that the Wild West, she used the term deliberately, had produced in her observation not primarily the violence and lawlessness that popular Eastern accounts emphasized, but rather a particular kind of directness in the people who had built lives here. A willingness to say what was needed when it was needed, because in a place where the gap between statement and consequence was often very small, the gap between truth and its evasion was a luxury that practical life refused. She quoted her mother. She quoted her father's masthead motto, which he had printed at the top of every edition: "The truth is not improved by decoration." She sent a copy of that edition to the Denver Post, which reprinted the editorial in full. She sent a copy to the Rocky Mountain News, which ran a profile of the Courier as one of the notable community papers in the Colorado Territory. She sent a copy to the Springfield paper that had been her father's competitor, and which had, over the years, become something closer to a correspondent, trading information across the distance. She did not send a copy to anyone she was trying to impress, because impressing people had never been her orientation. She sent it to people who would find it useful. Benjamin read the anniversary editorial as he read everything she wrote, with the full attention of someone who was genuinely interested and never bored by the particular working of her mind. When he was done, he said, "You should collect these into a book." She had not considered this. She turned it over in her mind with the practical attention she gave to feasible suggestions. "That," she said, "is an interesting idea." "I'm glad I occasionally have them," he said. "You have them more than occasionally," she said, which was true. Over 7 years of building a life and 2 newspapers together, he had served as a kind of informal board of the Courier since its founding, not as an editor, but as the person she thought out loud with. She had found his judgment consistently sound, and his perspective genuinely different from her own in ways that were productive rather than obstructive. He was also, 7 years in, the person she argued with most, which was entirely compatible with him being the person she loved most, and which she had figured out within the first year that this was how it was going to be, and found it entirely satisfactory. In 1891, the Colorado Territory became Colorado State. The Courier covered the transition with the attention it deserved, the new state government, the implications for local land ownership, the question of water rights that was becoming the central economic question of the region. Mamie wrote a 3-part series on water rights that was later cited in a state legislative debate. Benjamin, whose expertise in land law had expanded significantly through his years of registry work, contributed technical analysis to the series, which Mamie cited clearly and attributed to him, because she was constitutionally incapable of taking credit for things she had not done. The spring of 1892 brought a drought that stressed the ranching valley significantly. The Courier ran regular coverage of the conditions and the community response, and Mamie organized, through the paper, a voluntary exchange system that allowed ranching families to share water access across property lines during the worst months. It was not journalism in the traditional sense, and she knew it, and she wrote a brief editor's note acknowledging that she was making a choice to act rather than only observe, because the observation was clear enough, and the need was immediate enough, and she believed that being plain-spoken about the distinction between reporting and advocacy was more honest than pretending the line didn't exist. This note generated more response than the water exchange itself. Several readers wrote to say that they had never considered the distinction, and others wrote to say they thought all journalism was advocacy, whether it admitted it or not. And one reader wrote a long and thoughtful letter disputing her position that Mamie printed in full because it was genuinely interesting. She wrote back to that reader, a farmer named Hutchins from the Eastern Valley, and they maintained a correspondence for several years, the kind of correspondence that frontier newspapers generated between people who had found, in the simple act of honest public writing, a means of thinking together across distance. Thomas started school in the fall of 1891 at the Prosperity School that had been expanded the previous year to accommodate the growing community. He was 6 years old, with Mamie's directness and Benjamin's steady thoughtfulness in a combination that his teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Garfield, described at the first parent meeting as both impressive and occasionally exhausting. Mamie found this deeply satisfying. Benjamin found it familiar. Clara, at 3, was already interested in the printing press in a way that required supervision. She had an aptitude for the mechanical aspects of it, the setting of type, the arrangement of the form, that was apparent even at an age when most of the interaction was theoretical and largely tactile. Elias the typesetter had appointed himself her unofficial instructor, on the grounds that a child who liked to touch things in a print shop was better taught to touch them correctly than discouraged in a way that would not work anyway. Benjamin watched this with the thoughtful attention he gave to all things his children chose, and one evening in the kitchen after both children were asleep, he said to Mamie, "She's going to work at the paper." "She's 3, Mamie said. "She's going to work at the paper," he said. Mamie thought about it. "Yes," she said, "she is." The years moved forward with the quality that good years have, full of the ordinary and the consequential in the proportion that life manages when it is being lived well. Thomas grew into a young man of 12 who read everything available to him and had opinions about all of it, a characteristic his parents found simultaneously gratifying and occasionally loud. Clara, at 9, had graduated from touching the press to setting small amounts of type under Elia's supervision, and had begun to take a proprietary interest in the Monday edition's layout that Elias encouraged and that Mamie recognized, with a warmth she did not try to manage, as her own earliest relationship to her father's press. Benjamin had been offered, twice more, positions in Denver with the State Land Office, and had twice more declined, each time with clarity and without ambivalence. Prosperity was where he had built something. It was where his wife's work was rooted. It was where his children were learning the world. The Denver offices were more prestigious and paid better, and would have taken him out of reach of the things that mattered. He served, in addition to his registry work, on the board of the Prosperity School and later on the County Water Board, positions in which his technical expertise and his hard-won understanding of the relationship between documentation and justice were genuinely useful. He was not a man who sought public prominence, but he was a man who did the work that needed doing, and the county recognized this without requiring him to be visible about it. In the autumn of 1895, Mamie wrote a piece about the passage of time that was unlike anything she had written before. She had been a journalist for 12 years, a newspaper owner for 12 years, a wife for 11, a mother for 10. The piece was not a summary or a retrospective. It was present, attentive, the kind of writing that lives entirely in the particular moment it is describing. She described the Courier office on a Tuesday morning with the press running and the smell of ink, and the sound of Elia's whistling, something indeterminate, and Clara at the case of type, with her dark head bent in concentration, and the light coming through the front window onto the stack of paper ready for folding. She described it with the same plain care she gave to everything, the care that came not from aesthetic intention but from the belief that if something is true and present, it deserves full attention. Benjamin read it that evening and said, after a long silence, "This is the best thing you have ever written." She considered disagreeing with him on the grounds that the Whitmore series had been more important. She considered it honestly and concluded that important and best were different things and that he was possibly right. "I think I was writing about us," she said, "about all of it." "I know," he said, "I recognized it." The winter of 1895 into 1896 was mild by Colorado standards, which was a relief after several difficult years in the valley. The Coles family had their 20th anniversary on the Coles ranch that November, and Mamie and Benjamin went and spent an afternoon and evening in the kitchen and around the fire with people who had been, from the very beginning of their time in Prosperity, the kind of friends that frontier life produces, made by necessity and kept by choice. Ephraim Coles, gray-haired now but still solidly built, made a toast to the Fairchilds that was brief and genuine. To the two most useful people in this valley, who arrived here with better timing than they knew. Mamie, who did not typically enjoy being toasted, accepted it with a warmth that she did not manage or contain. Benjamin, sitting beside her, caught her eye and held it for a moment, and she saw in his face the same thing that had been there the morning she had told him about Thomas, and the morning she had told him about Clara, and the morning the Whitmore conviction had been confirmed, and the morning of every good thing that had happened in the years between, that complete, unguarded, uncomplicated happiness that belonged entirely and specifically to him. She took his hand under the table. He held it through the rest of the toast, and through the stories that followed, and through the long, comfortable evening that extended well into the Colorado night with the firelight and the coffee, and the voices of people who trusted each other. When they drove home in the wagon, with the stars enormous over the dark Colorado plain and the mountains black against the sky to the west, Thomas and Clara drowsing under blankets in the wagon bed, Mamie sat close to Benjamin on the bench seat with his arm around her shoulders and the reins loose in his hands, and the horse finding its own way along the familiar road, because it was the horse that had made this journey many times and knew it as well as either of them. She thought about a woman who had arrived in a small, formal town with a satchel full of documents and a conviction that the true thing was always worth saying. She thought about a man standing at a wall in a bright room with a telegram in his hand, deciding whether to run or stay and choosing to walk to the center. She thought about plain speaking and hidden motives brought to light and the dark past that becomes simply the past when you stop running from it. She thought about the forbidden feelings that became the only real ones, about the forced choice that turned out to be no choice at all. She thought about secrets dissolved in truth, and about the particular sacrifice of building a life in the open without the comfortable shelter of pretension or evasion. She thought that her father had been right. The truth was not improved by decoration. And she thought that sometimes, occasionally, rarely, in the proportion that life permits, the true thing is also the beautiful thing. The plain-spoken word is also the one that reaches through all the formality and the careful social architecture and touches something that doesn't need to be dressed up, because it is already and precisely and exactly what it is. "Benjamin," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you walked to the center of the room," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was when something true was being said, and he was giving it the attention it deserved. "So am I," he said. "I'm glad you pulled the thread." The mountains were dark and enormous to the west. The stars were clear. The horse moved at a steady walk along the road it knew, carrying them home through the Colorado night, carrying all of it, the work done and the work continuing, the children sleeping, the years ahead still open and available and full of the ordinary remarkable things that a life built in honesty tends to produce. Mamie Dalton Fairchild leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and closed her eyes, and listened to the sound of the horse's feet on the road, even and unhurried, one step and then the next, all the way home.